So this lecture on week 4 of Sustainable Energy is about energy security. Energy security is really about what happens when energy is not available to us at the right price. What if it's not stable? What if the sources that we're getting energy from are not secure? And energy resources play this critical role in economic growth and human well-being. And that will continue to be a big concern to policymakers in the future all across the world in developing and developed countries. And when I did a poll in last week's tutorial about what you think energy security is, these were all some of the factors that you discussed. So it was about diversity, stability, availability, low import dependence, adequacy, redundancy, quality of life, wealth, price, access. So energy security is really multidimensional and it can't be reduced to a single metric. It's really important because our whole economy, our whole quality of life and our way of life depends on the accessibility of energy at an affordable price from a reliable source. And without that, the health of the economy and our quality of life would be severely diminished. So this lecture, I'm going to go through some examples in world history of when of big energy security crises and what the implications of that are and why we're so concerned about energy security. And then I'll talk through some of the different metrics for energy security at the global level. Later on in the course, we'll go through energy security metrics for Ireland and a recent report for Ireland. So this won't focus on Ireland, this focuses at the global level at a macroscopic view. So we'll answer the questions about when countries don't have their own energy sources, how do they adapt? What are the consequences when the price of energy is high? What are the consequences when the price of energy is too low? Or what if our supplies is disrupted? And for countries whose economies depend on exporting oil, what happens when these balances go out of line? For example, here are some of the major geopolitical events that happened in the 20th and 21st century related to energy security. The 1970s oil crises triggered by embargoes from energy producing countries. The 2010 Arab Spring, which some theorize can be traced back to energy prices, and the 2011 Fukushima nuclear meltdown, which shows how reliant our energy systems are on fragile infrastructure, which can be related to weather and events like that. So first of all, we talk about the institutions in the security of oil supply. Security of oil supply. Oil has been one of the major energy sources of the 20th century. So this lecture mainly focuses on oil, but many of the different factors can be traced to gas and coal as well. So in 1870, John Rockefeller incorporated Standard Oil in Ohio, and that company quickly emerged as the dominant player in the global oil markets. It drove energy prices down, bought up competition, and Standard Oil expanded across the US and began exporting to overseas markets, including China. So it was so successful that by 1890 it controlled nearly 90% of refined oil in the US. Before the 1970s, oil production in the world was dominated by these multinationals. First of all, the US Standard Oil monopoly was dissolved in 1911. Out of that dissolution of the monopoly, it was split up by the Supreme Court in the United States because of antitrust violations. And Chevron, Exxon and Mobil are now a single company, were formed as a result. We also have BP, which was created out of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which was formed in 1908 following the discovery of oil in what's now Iran. There's Royal Dutch and Shell. They both merged in 1907 to form Royal Dutch Shell, and they had the aim of remaining competitive in the face of increasing competition from US firms. They're based in Europe. And then Gulf Oil and Texaco were established before that in 1901, following the discovery of oil in Texas. So these 7 companies became known as the Seven Sisters, and they went on to control 85% of the world's oil reserves at their peak in the 1970s. But to counter this kind of growing, I suppose, geo-domination of the world by these 7 oil companies, which were based in a small few countries, countries where the oil reserves were based, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, officials from these countries met in Baghdad in 1960 to discuss how to handle the price cuts which were enforced by these oil companies in the 60s and 50s. The price cuts basically were agreed by these oil companies. So these countries, officials from these countries, agreed to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, with the aim of reducing competition between their countries and controlling prices. So the OPEC was formed in 1960, and over the next 2 decades, OPEC expanded to include Qatar, Indonesia, Libya, United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Nigeria, Ecuador, and Gabon. Most of those countries also took control of their oil reserves between 1960 and 1976. They either bought out or forcibly took control shares from the international oil companies who had come in and started extracting oil. In response to the kind of geopolitical power imposed by OPEC, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, was born after the 1973 oil crisis, which I'll go through in a second. This is when industrialized countries found that they were not adequately equipped to deal with the oil embargo imposed by these major oil producing companies. And that first oil shock led to the creation of the IEA in 1974. Their broad mandate was on energy security and energy policy coordination. That included setting up a collective action mechanism to respond effectively to potential disruptions in oil supply. So every member country of the IEA is required to hold 80 days of oil reserves, which the IEA can strategically release if there's a shock to the global system. That was activated only 3 times since the agency's creation. The first was in January during the first Gulf War, when there was concern about a supply of oil from the Middle East. The second was in 2005 after the hurricanes Katrina and Rita damaged oil infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico, and the third was in 2011 during the Libyan crisis, and Ireland was among the founding members. You can get the IEA's data and their reports through the UCC website here, which is very useful. Initially, the concerns for these different organizations was, is there enough oil and is the price right? And the answer to those questions were different depending on the institution at hand, I suppose. So in the 1970s, there were these two energy crises, basically. There was a series of energy crises kind of that spanned from the late 60s, and those were caused by problems in the Middle East. But the most significant started in 1973 when Arab oil producers imposed an embargo. The decision to boycott America and punish the West came as a response to the West's support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War against Egypt. And the whole oil embargo, where OPEC basically decided to close the pipelines and increase the oil price, led to the price of crude in dollars in that day from $3 per barrel to $12 by 1974, so caused a quadrupling in oil prices. The price of petrol at the pump rocketed, making all transport more expensive. All parts of the economy obviously rely on transport, so the cost of goods went up. The economies in these countries, including Ireland, were already struggling to cope with high food prices caused by global food shortages, and the increase in oil price led to an inflation rate which hit 24%. So there was price increases of some 24% in a single year, something almost unimaginable now. So the 1970s oil crises, they knocked the wind out of the global economy, and they helped trigger a stock market crash, caused soaring inflation and high unemployment. These were very testing times for industrial relations, when workers demanded higher wages, which then fed to even greater price rises, and also very testing times for political stability. Here is the first OPEC, or one of the meetings of OPEC in 1974. There was another meeting in 2015. Closed petrol pumps, long lines waiting for fuel and rationing. From then onwards, particularly after a similar a crisis happened in 1979, which led which was around the time of the fall of the Shah in Iran, energy importing countries paid much more attention to the areas of the world that they were importing from. So companies based in the West diversified their sources of energy. For example, looking for alternative gas and oil supplies in Nigeria and Indonesia. High oil prices also encouraged a switch to smaller vehicles, created an environment where Japanese firms like Toyota and Honda became dominant. Japan never had any indigenous oil supply, so energy efficiency was already a very important thing for Japan. So Japanese car manufacturers were already focused on energy efficiency. The early 70s also led to a resurgence in interest in alternative forms of energy, such as solar, which gradually withered as the price of oil began to fall and supply insecurity was not such a concern. Britain developed its oil and gas industry as well from the North Sea reserves and became self-sufficient in oil and gas after that. It took countries with much smaller indigenous supplies to take radical new steps. For example, Brazil made a revolutionary switch from running its vehicles from petrol to ethanol from sugarcane. So it looked at diversified sources of energy for transportation. And this chart shows the real crude oil price in dollars per barrel. Real means that it's adjusted for inflation, so it's suppose not the price of the day, but the price adjusted for today's for its value today. And it shows the history of oil prices linked against world events and different depressions. So, for example, here in the 1800s, in the first oil boom, the price of oil skyrocketed during the U.S. Civil War when oil supplies were limited, and then fell again when production accelerated from Russia, and from the U.S. especially. Different world events, including World War II, World War I particularly, created a huge surge in demand for oil, and since the price is some way a reflection of the balance between demand and supply. When the supply is risky and the demand is high, then the price goes up. World War II, there was high supply of oil at the time, and but World War II was still a huge driver of energy demand. You can see that the first real test in the 20th century for oil prices was in the 1970s, 1973 here, and 1979 here during the Yom Kippur War and the Iranian Revolution, which I referred to, causing the price of oil to absolutely skyrocket. And in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, oil price went down again, which relaxed the attention on alternative supplies like solar and energy efficiency. In the 2000s, though, there have been huge geopolitical events and natural disasters which have caused short-term effects on oil prices. There was North Korean missile tests. There was a 2006 conflict between Israel and Lebanon. There was Hurricane Katrina, Iranian nuclear plans in 2006, various other pressures which caused very unstable oil prices in the 2000s. And basically increasing demand from countries like China and limited investment in infrastructure caused skyrocketing energy prices again by 2008. So there's a peak in energy prices in 2008. 2008, then there was the onset of a global recession. The recession caused demand for energy to shrink in late 2008, and oil prices collapsed in the euros of the day from a high of $147 in December 2008 to a low of 32 a few months later. If you look at this year, 2020, up and as far as April, it's been a really incredible year for oil, and you might have noticed the petrol at the pump. If the price has plunged, you might have noticed if you have to fill up your oil tank, if your house is heated on oil, that it's exceptionally cheap. That's because oil prices this year have plunged to historic lows. There's a number of reasons for that. This was happening already before the global pandemic in 2020. There was a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which led to significant falls. And even the oil price plunged in April 20th to negative values. So the world was so awash with oil that basically buyers who had promised to buy oil from West Texas had to pay people to take it away. There was also a row between Russia and Saudi Arabia here, which caused them to increase their release oil onto the market, and also there've been huge changes to global oil demand as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The global aviation sector has almost been locked down. People aren't buying petrol at the pumps either. So the question is, what is the future? And I think forecasting oil prices is really a fool's game. There's really no pattern in the long term to oil prices. But what's very important is that it's really tied up with geopolitical events and has huge consequences for people's lives, and the consequences for the economy are stark. One such example is that food and oil prices are very closely correlated. Here is the index of world food prices indexed on the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, food price index, averaged against or indexed against the average oil price here. You can see that they're very highly correlated. And when grain prices spiked in 2007 and 2008, many people across the world obviously depend on cheap food to sustain themselves. But in 2007, 2008, when the global, basically the grain price rose so significantly, bread prices rose as well. In Egypt, in 2008, bread prices rose 2008 by 37%. Unemployment rose as well, and more people were depending on subsidized bread. The government didn't make any more bread available, and Egypt's annual food price inflation continued and caused very consequential political instability. There was huge protests, and some speculate that this gave rise to the Arab Spring here in 2008, which obviously had huge consequences for 2010 geopolitical events. I won't go into that there, but you can trace the war in Syria and different geopolitical events back to that. The next global event I want to talk about is the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which happened in 2011. It was the most severe nuclear accident since the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. The accident was started by an earthquake which triggered a tsunami on Friday, 11th of March 2011. When the earthquake was detected, the active reactors, they automatically shut down, and their normal power generating fission reactions were stopped. Because of these shutdowns and other electrical grid supply problems, the reactor's electricity supplies failed, and the emergency diesel generators automatically started to make up for that. Critically, these were required to provide electrical power to the pumps that circulated coolant through the reactor's cores, and that continued circulation is absolutely vital to remove decay heat, which continues to be produced after fission has stopped. But the earthquake also generated a 14-meter high tsunami that arrived shortly afterwards, and it swept through the plant's seawall. As you can see here, it's on the coast. There was a seawall, but the 14-meter high tsunami swept over that and flooded the lower parts of a few of the reactors. That caused the failure of emergency generators and a loss of power to the circulating pumps. And then because of that lack of circulation, there was a lack of core cooling, which was essential to prevent a meltdown. That led to 3 nuclear meltdowns, 3 hydrogen explosions, and the release of radioactive contamination. Now, obviously, the cleanup after that, the economic consequences, the personal toll was huge. Over 150,000 residents in the local area were evacuated because of airborne radioactive contamination in the air. Now, there's been ongoing controversy about the health effects of the disaster, about the health effects of radiation and so on. A 2014 report by the United Nations Scientific Committee on the effects of atomic radiation found no increase in stillbirths, miscarriages, and physical disorders following the accident. But there's an ongoing, very intensive cleanup program to decontaminate the area. That'll take 30 to 40 years, some estimates cause. Now, this was primarily, like at the top level, caused by natural forces, a tsunami caused by an earthquake. But the consequences for the meltdown can be traced back to institutional and human errors. So in 2012, an independent investigation commission in Japan traced the causes of the accident back to foreseeable events, and they found that the Tokyo Electric Power Company, the plant operator, had failed to meet basic safety requirements such as risk assessment, preparing for containing collateral damage, and developing evacuation plans. Now, after that, the International Atomic Energy Agency said that the kind of government organizations should have had oversight. But what I really want to stress is the consequences for energy security, not only at the primary level, that there were human and institutional factors which led to this nuclear meltdown, which caused huge evacuations, loss of power, and so on. That is one sort of facet of energy security here. But the reaction to this caused huge kind of dynamics in energy security too. First of all, due to the shutdown of most nuclear power plants in Japan, after that there was a big political backlash and public backlash against nuclear power, who said that it was unsafe, it was not possible to rely on this. Japan's energy self-sufficiency rate plummeted. So previously 20% of Japan's energy was created indigenously, 80% was imported. That 20% level of self-sufficiency reduced to 11% in 2011 after the shutdown of nuclear power. Since then, the self-sufficiency rate has remained under 10%, which is extremely low compared to other countries. Japan also has significantly increased its energy imports from overseas to compensate for that. That reliance on foreign energy deteriorates the government budget deficit, but it also brings political risk when over 80% of the imported oil comes from the Middle East. A second consequence is the dependence on fossil fuels. So Japan is highly dependent on fossil energy compared with many other countries. It accounted for around 94% of Japan's energy mix when the oil crisis happened in 1973, and Japan's great efforts to kind of bring about nuclear energy and reduce dependence on fossil fuels were caused by the oil crisis. Since then, Japan made great efforts, and the dependence on oil reduced to about 81% in 2010. However, after the shutdown of nuclear power as a cause of this disaster, the dependence on fossil energy rebounded to 89% in 2016, and that approached the level of the time of the oil shock. The increase of fossil energy is meant to fill that gap caused by the suspension of nuclear energy, and now Japan is extremely vulnerable to another oil shock, as crude oil accounts for more than 40% of its energy source. A third point was that, in terms of energy security after this disaster, is that the price of electricity in Japan rose very greatly due to the soaring energy cost. Electricity rates peaked in 2016, and households' electricity prices increased by about 24%, and that rate was about 38% for industries. A final point is that developing renewable energy is obviously a counterpoint to those import dependence and reliance on fossil fuel points. But renewables currently are far from being able to substitute for nuclear and fossil energy in Japan's energy mix. So while energy security is multifaceted, multidisciplinary, multidimensional, the next part of this lecture is about trying to define energy security, find some quantitative factors which we can use to explain energy security, and kind of starting with some popular definitions of energy security from these institutions. Back to the IEA in 2001 said that energy security is defined as the availability of regular supply of energy at an affordable price. So there's three factors here: availability, that it's there when you want it; that it's regular, so it's not going to drop out at any moment; and it's affordable, so that you can do the things that you want when you want them at a price that's right. Another definition here is that energy insecurity is defined as the loss in welfare that might occur as the result of change in the price or availability of energy. So this definition more depends on the effects of energy insecurity rather than what energy security is. And in some ways, it can be easier to define energy security as what happens when it's not secure. Another definition here is that energy security is low vulnerability of vital energy systems. So I suppose that broadens the concept of energy security to vulnerability for many other dimensions. But the core among all these definitions is basically an absence of or protection from or adaptability to, I suppose, threats that are caused or might have an impact on the energy supply chain. And those threats can be geopolitical, they can be human, they can be infrastructural, they can be climate related, nuclear accident related. There can be many different threats, not necessarily because of actions in single countries, but it's still difficult to quantify. But here you might define it as these three A's, basically: affordability of energy, availability, that it comes at the right time, that it's accessible, that it doesn't come from vulnerable areas, and that it's acceptable is another dimension. Whether are you energy secure if you're using an energy source that's going to destroy your environment? So energy security is also very much tied into climate change. And then there are different subjective perspectives. For example, sovereignty. Many countries strive to be self-sufficient. They want not to be reliant on importing foreign resources, because the question about who controls and competes for energy resources is very important, and this really goes into the realms of political science and international relations. Fascinating history of the history of oil and international relations, tracing back different wars in the Middle East. I'd highly recommend you to read into that if you're interested in it. Also, robustness. What about critical infrastructure and scarcity? For example, the reliance on pipelines is hugely crucial to energy security. The question about how to engineer energy systems so they're not vulnerable, that's another question that maybe is more focused for engineers and natural sciences. And then the question about resilience. So how can markets be controlled? How can policy instruments be used to make sure that that when we're liberalizing energy markets, how can we guard against certain risks? And those sort of disciplines that might address those are economics, political science again, or complexity science. This is an interesting graphic which shows these tries to give these different definitions, dimensions of energy security. First of all, in terms of sources of risk. Risk to the energy system can come from technical sources, so mechanical failure, infrastructure interdependency. So basically the machines, the infrastructure fails to deliver energy, and that causes a supply shock. There's also the human risk source. So, strategic withholding, which happened in the 1970s, sabotage, terrorism. What happens, if there's an attack on electricity markets, which are increasingly digitized now and can be hacked. Political instability. What if whole regimes fall and markets for supply collapse, related to geopolitical risk. Underinvestment then is another risk. What if the oil price is so low that oil companies don't have the capital to invest in more supply, and that can cause supply shortages. And then another category of risks comes from natural risks, resource intermittency. If we design an energy system which is completely dependent on wind with no backup, then we won't have energy when the wind is not blowing. So this sort of the risk of intermittency is also high. Resource depletion, that's not such a huge concern now that climate change has trumped all this natural disasters, as in the case of Fukushima. So basically there's all these different dimensions of risk, and they can affect the energy system and on society at different levels. So first of all, these different risks can cause a shortage of the commodity supply, or they can cause a shock in terms of the continuity of supply. So there can be like electricity blackouts, or for days at a time there mightn't be petrol at the forecourts. These in turn affect the continuity of the economy and environment and society. And then there can be different kind of filters for severity as well. They can be very short and swift impacts. They can be large or small. They can be spread locally or globally. They can be unique or frequent. So there's different dimensions of these as well. Now I'll go through some different metrics for how energy security can be measured. We're very interested in trying to quantify things here to quantify risk. These are some simple energy security metrics. For example, the first is supply versus demand. So if a country has low supply and high demand, or it produces low and it consumes high, so what is the balance between production versus consumption? That's very much related to what the resource estimates for different fuels are. How many years of different resources do we have left? And both of those are very much tied into the reserve to production ratios. So if you have 10 billion barrels of reserves and you're extracting at 1 billion per year, then there's you only have 10 years of reserves left. There's also the import dependence, which is also known as the energy trade balance, the diversity of energy consumption within a country, how reliant is a country or a single sector on one fuel, the energy price, electricity stability, for example, blackouts, the energy intensity, political stability, demand indicators include energy per capita or energy per value added per sector, and then ones more related to climate include carbon intensity or efficiency. And then I'll go through some of these in more detail. So the first is who's producing the oil. It also relates to gas, and the US originally dominated oil production here. The oil booms, but swiftly they were overtaken by Russia and countries in the Middle East who found resources themselves. And then basically the US became such an oil consumer that they were a net oil importer until very recently, until there was a shale boom in the 2000s, which led to the US becoming a net oil exporter for the first time. So that kind of indicator of who's producing and who's importing as well is very important. Here is oil production by region, and you can see that the Middle East is the main oil producer, followed by North America, Central and South America. Europe produces very little oil from the North Sea, Africa and Asia Pacific. So oil production is growing, mainly fueled by the Middle East. And oil consumption is also growing very rapidly. And it's the Asia Pacific region really that has the biggest difference between production and consumption. And you can see here that North America is a very big oil producer, but it's also a huge oil consumer. So it's really the balance that matters here. So whether a country is a net importer or exporter of energy is indicated by their energy trade balance. This is the trade balance here, where negative numbers indicate that it's net energy exporter, while net energy importers have a positive energy trade balance. So based on energy trade balances, it can be inferred that regions with positive energy trade balances are more energy insecure compared with those with negative energy trade balances. The largest net importers were Asia and Europe, and the largest exporters were Middle East and former Soviet regions, CIS here. Europe's energy security situation is really precarious because of dwindling energy supplies that mean increasing reliance on energy imports. Another important metric is proven oil reserves, and again, this also is related to gas and coal as well, but we focus here mainly on oil. Energy reserves refers to the estimated quantity of energy sources known to exist with reasonable certainty and which can be recovered with presently available technology at an economically viable cost. That's what an energy reserve means, that that we know reasonably certainly that it's there and that it can be recovered at today's oil price with currently available technology. A country's energy resources and the extent to which they are developed is an important determinant of energy security as well. In general, countries with vast energy resources are more energy secure compared with those with small energy resources. Over time, changes can occur that alter the country's energy resources and then improve or worsen its energy security. For example, the discovery of oil and gas reserves in the North Sea had a significant impact on Norway's economy and energy security and made Norway a rich oil exporting country. That's also the case with countries which have recently discovered new energy reserves. This graph shows the growing global proven oil reserves over time. It shows that the Middle East has the greatest quantity of proven oil reserves, followed by the Americas. These two regions account for over 75% of the world's total proven oil reserves. That fact doesn't confer these countries or these regions with energy security. It's just one factor which is important for the landscape. Assessing oil security requires you to also consider what their consumption is, and how these are evolving over time, or and where they're coming from and where they're going to. This graph, interestingly, also shows that over time, with the exception of Europe, most regions of the world are improving their oil reserves. So you can see here that Europe has very small oil reserves, and they're declining over time as we're consuming most of that. You would also assume that as oil reserves increase over time, countries in general are improving their oil security, but that only matters if we're also reducing our energy consumption, I suppose. So what also matters not only is the amount of oil reserves that are there, but how quickly they're being extracted. And this indicator is called the oil reserves to production ratio, or it's called RPR, or R divided by P. This is the remaining amount of non-renewable resource expressed in time. So basically the amount of resource known divided by the amount used per year. So that's expressed in years. And here you can see the reserve to production ratio in different countries by region. Here, the regions with the highest RP ratio is Central and South America. Countries like Venezuela have recently gathered huge increasing oil reserves. North America has about 30 years of oil left at current production rates. Middle East more than 60, and Europe very little. So that's the most widely quoted of the key indicators used in the oil and gas industry, and it has a certain strategic significance for companies. And companies try to keep their own RP ratios constant at about 10 years. So they'll try to keep exploring and keep finding more proven reserves in order to keep their production at about 10 years. A ratio which falls too low indicates an oil company in poor health. And for a country or region, a value that falls too low can be a warning of impending scarcity. It can also be a misleading kind of indicator to the average person because it's expressed in years. It suggests that, the Middle East oil is going to run out in 60 years. But realistically, the expansion and decline of energy consumption is more follows a bell curve or a logistical curve, which means that it peaks at a certain rate and then declines over time. But especially when oil prices are high and reserves lower, then companies and countries are encouraged to expand their extraction and their exploration to find more proven reserves. Another important metric is the dependency rate. So basically the import dependence, which is the extent to which an economy relies on imports in order to meet its energy needs. It's measured by the share of net imports in gross inland energy consumption. So and in the EU, these are energy dependency rates for the EU. The average is about 58% in 2018, which means more than half of the EU's energy needs were met by net imports. That rate ranges from over 90% in Malta and Luxembourg to below 25% in Romania, Denmark, and Estonia. The dependency rate on energy imports has increased since 2000, when it was just 56%. The EU mainly depends on Russia. So here is where EU imports its crude oil. EU mainly depends on Russia for imports of crude oil, natural gas, and solid fuels, followed by Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Norway for crude oil and natural gas. So the stability of the EU's energy supply could be threatened if a high proportion of imports are concentrated among a relatively few external partners. And when in 2018, almost 2/3 of the EU's crude oil imports came from Russia, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, we can see that the political stability of these import countries is important, as well as the infrastructure which brings these energy sources to Europe. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to talking about diversity. Next, another indicator of energy security is simply the price of energy. So in general, energy prices are determined by the supply and demand conditions in energy markets, and also by the policies and regulations such as taxes and subsidies that the governments may use to regulate these markets to achieve particular outcomes. Energy prices are an important indicator of energy security to the extent that they embody information about energy scarcity. So a high energy price indicates energy scarcity, and also very importantly, energy affordability also plays a central role in energy investment decisions. So oil prices, as we said before, have fluctuated very widely according to different geopolitical events. Here they are since 1998. When oil prices are too high, they cause inflation, problems in economies, in oil-consuming economies. They cause unaffordability among households, decreases in living standards, but also high oil prices indicate or they encourage a shift to low-carbon and alternative sources, as we've seen before. If oil prices are too low, on the other hand, that can prevent investment in oil supply, which can cause shortages at a later date. It also removes income from oil-producing economies and can cause unrest and instability there, where many times energy is highly subsidized for populations. In terms of household energy security, then, we had other lectures on energy access, and I suppose lack of energy access is the most sort of critical indicator of household energy security vulnerability. So when a house doesn't have even any energy access supply, or it has unreliable supply, that is one very strong indicator. And as we know, several developing countries, there's a very strong proportion of the population who cannot access any modern energy at all. That can be due to high energy prices as well as just accessibility. Many countries, many households, even in Ireland, are considered fuel poor, where they can't heat their houses to an adequate extent, and filling up, say, their car with petrol has a disproportionate effect on their budget. Much of global energy consumption is subsidized for this reason, to keep energy affordable, but then that has knock-on consequences for climate change. So you can see the sort of interdependencies between energy security and climate change then. Another indicator we talk about is the diversity of fuel consumption. So all else being equal, economies that depend on a limited portfolio of non-renewable energy sources are less secure compared to those who take energy sources from a diverse range of supplies. So energy systems that are diverse, they're more resilient, and also they're more adaptable to shocks in energy supplies. Here's a chart of consumption by fuel in different countries. Some countries are more dependent on oil and some less, or some more dependent on natural gas. And in general, the wider the diversity and the wider the reliance on renewable energy sources, the more energy secure they are. So there's an example from the Russian-Ukrainian gas crisis is an example of the vulnerability that can result from the dependence on a single energy supplier. So I suppose it's not just the reliance on a single energy source, but also if that energy source comes from a single region. So in January 2006, there was a disagreement about the price of natural gas and the cost of the transit of natural gas. Russia cut off all gas supplies passing through Ukraine, and that adversely affected several European countries. In 2009, then again, disagreements about natural gas prices result in disruption of natural gas supplies from Russia to 18 European countries. The severity of that threat to Europe's energy system stems from the fact that Russia supplies about a quarter of the natural gas consumed in the EU, and at about 80% of natural gas exports from Russia to the EU are through pipelines across Ukraine. So in response to this vulnerability and this threat, the Southern Gas Corridor was started as a response to this overdependence that many countries in Europe have on this resource gas from Russia to meet most of their natural gas requirements. And the overarching goal of this Southern Gas Corridor was to improve the EU's energy security by diversifying the routes and the sources of gas supplies to the EU. And that basically caused an investment in the strategic infrastructure, which is gas pipelines from the Caspian Basin, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean Basin, which reduces the dependence on Russian natural gas supplies. So the contribution of diversity to energy security also applies to other domains such as transportation fuels. So you can have a whole economy that's fairly diverse, but all transportation fuels, for example, can be reliant on one fuel. It's the same when it goes for the generation of electricity. If all your electricity generation is gas fueled and there's a disruption in gas price or supplies, then you're much more vulnerable than if there's a diversity of electricity sources. In the transportation sector, the fuels that are most currently used are gasoline and diesel, as we know, because of their high energy density and the efficiency and the development of the car industry. But some measures that are currently being undertaken to enhance transport energy security include development of ethanol, natural gas, biodiesel, and electricity. But there are also difficulties with that. One of the final indicators then is the share of renewables in the energy mix. In general, renewable energy is, by its definition, non-depletable. So, there's not like a date by which solar or wind energy will be depleted. So that's one facet of energy security. Renewables also tend to be indigenously produced, so we use our own wind and solar resources and hydro resources. But high dependency on renewables can cause other forms of energy insecurity, for example, intermittency if that's not dealt with properly, or scarcity of minerals which go into producing the elements, for example, batteries, lithium ion, and so on, and cobalt, or elements which go into creation of solar panels.